And good evening, I'm Errol Laborde. Easter is unusually early this year, but that situation might change in the future if a movement to standardize the date is successful. Such a change would also have an impact on Carnival. We'll examine the implications. In Baton Rouge, the legislative session is right on schedule, with another session to follow. We'll look at both. We'll also examine improved police response numbers, an upcoming millage vote targeted at public safety, short-term rentals, and the state's cost for the Passion TV broadcasts. In the house for us are tonight's informed sources: Steve Beatty, editor of The Lens; Stephanie Grace, columnist for the New Orleans Advocate; and Jeff Adelson, reporter for the New Orleans Advocate. And Stephanie, we'll go to you. Before the legislature took its Easter weekend break, the governor announced those cuts that people have been dreading. What did we learn?
It's not all terrible news, I should say. The governor on Thursday announced, basically, if you'll remember in the special session, the legislature did not completely close the budget gap. They largely did, but there was about a $70 million gap. So they still had to find cuts to...
That's a pretty big gap.
It's pretty good. I mean, compared to what it was almost $1 billion to begin with, so proportionally. But it's a lot of money, especially from agencies that have seen very big cuts. And of course, as always, higher ed and healthcare are on the front lines of this. They found about $40 million in savings, which is interesting. So those don't have to be direct cuts. But there still are $30 million that they are cutting. They are cutting it all from healthcare. That's the big news. None from higher education. And the governor said, look, higher education has been defunded for years. And now the universities, state colleges have to absorb the shortfall in TOPS money, which we already knew about. That's about $28 million. The state doesn't have enough money to, and that's separate from the $70 million. So basically, that's a big cut that the colleges for the rest of this academic year already have to absorb.
Explain to people quickly who wonder, why is it every time there are cuts, it's always from healthcare and education?
Higher ed, sometimes corrections too. This is a long-standing problem, and it is because the legislature, in its wisdom, through laws and also constitutional amendments, has protected so many different other areas, has basically said money has to go to, the MFP is a big one, that's money for K-12 education. Everything else is dedicated. Some people asked, why don't we just raise gasoline taxes during this session with the price of gas so low? That's a big chunk of money. Well, that money, we probably should do that, but that money can't go into the general fund. That goes for road work, also needs. So always higher education and healthcare just see this seesaw. When times are good, they're well funded. When times are bad, they are not well funded. Again, healthcare is getting the brunt of it this week. And one of the interesting things to watch, there's going to be about a $10 million cut in money to Bayou Health. That's the privatized Medicaid program that started under Governor Jindal. There's also a 1.5% cut to payments to the private partners in the public-private partnerships, the big one here in New Orleans, University Medical Center, and there are others around the state. So a lot of people watching what's going to happen with that, in part because the way these contracts were structured, the partners really have a right to walk away if they're unhappy. So, we do have to worry about this. I think they're going to give the governor more time to try to set things right, but it is a concern. And that's total for about $7 million, I think.
And of course, the University Medical Center, people are still watching it unfold and this new structure being built, and we still don't have that financial thing all straight right now.
We don't. And, Children's, of course, is the partner, and it's just a little precarious. It was almost set up to be precarious. And I think going back to the governor's race, a lot of these private partners were hoping once we got past Governor Jindal, things would stabilize, and we're not even close to there yet, although, of course, Governor Edwards hopes to. On the higher ed, he basically, one of the things he said at the news conference is interesting. We also have to look at next year's budget, which as of today is about, $750 million short. If they come back in a special session, they could close some of that gap. But right now they have to pass a budget with about $750 million in cuts. What he said is TOPS, again, a topic of huge interest to a lot of people, probably will not be fully funded as it stands now. So it could be that they would have to look at, figuring out who gets the money, and they might look at ACT scores, they might look at need. We don't know yet, but all of those things are in the mix if they are not able to find the additional
And for people
money.
who don't know, TOPS has been one really heralded program going back to Elman, Pat Taylor, where the state helps fund scholarships for colleges.
And it fully funds if you meet certain benchmarks, and they're not the most rigorous benchmarks. About a third of the students graduating in Louisiana qualify. You get free tuition at a state college. You still have to pay fees, you still have to pay housing, but the tuition itself is free. And the cost has really been rising in part because the state has been cutting direct aid to universities, so the universities have been raising tuition. That tuition circles back and gets paid for by the state largely through TOPS. Certainly for schools like LSU, it's largely TOPS. Other schools, they have many fewer students on TOPS.
You mentioned that it doesn't cover fees, and I think it was last year they added fees to the UL system per credit hour, and those fees,
they've gone quite
as
a
I
bit.
speak from experience
Yes.
with a child in Lafayette, at the University of Lafayette, the fees hit home. The housing costs. I mean, it's still a great
expensive.
deal.
It is.
I'm happy to have somebody pay the tuition,
Right.
but.
And we should mention this is the general session.
Sure.
The general session.
And this will be a topic during the general session. There are various proposals to try to get the cost of TOPS under control, and there are a whole bunch of different ideas out there. I think the most likely to pass is one that actually passed last year, but Governor Jindal vetoed, but Governor Edwards supports, and there's a lot of Republican support for it. And that's basically to freeze the cost of it, to say, I think it's based on next year's tuition. If tuition goes up beyond next year, TOPS doesn't automatically go up. The legislature will have to approve an increase. So this is one of the things we'll be talking about.
And we're definitely heading for another special session after this session.
At some point, yes.
Okay, Jeff, a few months ago, you, I think in partnership with Channel 4, did a series about the police response time in New Orleans Parish. And what was it back then, like an average of 40 minutes or something?
More than that. It was an average of more than an hour for overall responses.
So this is the response time to like 911 emergency calls. This week the police chief had a conference, and he had more encouraging figures.
Yeah. This week the police chief announced that since October, which is when our series came out, emergency 911 calls, so calls where someone was reporting that there was a crime in progress, or there had been a break-in and someone was still in the home, or incidents where you really need a cop on the scene immediately. The average response times in October for those was around 20 minutes. Now it's about 11 and a half minutes, which still, I think a lot of people would argue, if you've got an emergency situation and you need someone, you need an officer there immediately, you don't want to be waiting 11 minutes for someone to get there.
Plus, you're probably scared and uncertain.
Exactly. And you certainly, but it's certainly an improvement. The department's saying a lot of this is coming from some changes they've made. They've been moving some non-emergency calls to basically a phone-in system where people can take down reports over the phone. So that's freed up officers who are actually on the ground. They did recently reassign a number of officers who are on non-patrol duties back to patrol. And they've also been making some other changes aimed at prioritizing those emergency calls. There's also, it's worth noting, been some improvements in the time on non-emergency calls. When you get home and you find something's been stolen from your house and you don't need an officer immediately, those have been more modest gains, though. And the third point, I guess, with all that is that an extremely large portion of the improvement that we've seen over the last 6 months is coming from bringing some of the worst districts in the city, particularly New Orleans East, which has the worst response times in the entire city, bringing those numbers down rather than improving some of the better districts like Algiers that had been sort of around the 10 to 12 minute mark for emergency calls, and they're still in that area. What you're seeing is areas like New Orleans East have come down significantly, and that's bringing down the overall average.
Is it cynical to think that this improvement is announced just a week before the voters vote on a police and fire millage?
I don't know if it's cynical, but it's certainly well timed for that. The Landry administration is definitely looking for support for that millage, and one of the concerns that I think they're hearing back from residents is, why should we give you more money when we're not seeing a lot of results out of it so far?
And we're going to talk about that millage later, but also I think the point was made that this period covered Mardi Gras, when police schedules are really just shifted around a lot right there. So that period is probably really affects this number.
Yeah, I think the extensive police coverage during Mardi Gras is affecting the numbers a bit. There's also, although when you look at the final numbers that they had, those were from early this month, so that takes a little bit of the edge off. There's also an interesting phenomenon that's been pointed out by some people, where response times go down around Mardi Gras because you've got police on the parade routes and everywhere else, and then they spike in the week afterward because all those officers now have to take time off and recoup and everything else. So it's an interesting balance.
Okay. Thank you very much. Steve at the Lens, which does all kind of research all day long, all year long. One thing that y'all have been looking to, have done several articles, is short-term rentals. What are you finding out? Is it working or is it not? Or
Well, it's still illegal, but it tends to work for the people who are not afraid to break the law, because there's almost no enforcement going on right now. And that's part of the problem that the city is trying to solve. The City Planning Commission staff put together a report back in January that proposed some rules on how to regulate this. The commission itself took up those rules, trimmed it back a little bit, and then sent it on to the city council, which has been very quiet on the matter since
with
then.
laws not being enforced?
You're only allowed to have rentals for longer than 30 days, most parts of the cities, or longer than 60 days in the French Quarter. It's meant to discourage being able to rent out the bedroom in your house, or half of your double, or if you own a building and it's got 3 apartments in it, you can't rent them out short term. It's designed to be rental market for people who live here. And that's the main complaint from people in the neighborhoods, is that it's taking away and driving up rental prices, but it's taking away units that working folks would normally live in and turning it into high-priced mini hotels. People, though, on the other side who own those buildings, they believe that they should be able to do whatever they want to do with their building as long as it's within reasonable expectations, and if the place is zoned for residential, they feel like they should be able to rent it out.
And they can really make a lot more money, from what I understand, doing that.
I think they can make in a week what they would normally make in a
Yeah.
month off a long-term renter.
Well, and you can see that to a certain extent in the proliferation of these. There's several thousand, between 2,000 and 4,000 are most of the estimates from most of the analysts that have looked at this. 2,000 to 4,000 properties that are being used as short-term rentals rather than long-term homes as for homeowners or renters. And that actually seems to be one of the big clash points at which there's going to be some fighting over this, is whether you're going to need to have an owner-occupied unit that can rent out a room or half a double versus just buying up properties and using them using them wholesale for short-term rentals.
Either way, right now the regulations call for getting to be permitted to do that, to get an actual government document that says I can do this, and they want the services such as Airbnb or VRBO or HomeAway to pay attention to local regulations and make sure that they don't advertise or help market anything that tends to be illegal. And they said, well, we're in 34,000 communities across the country. We can't pay attention to 34,000 different levels of regulation. We expect the people who offer their places up for rental to be complying with the law. They've softened that a little bit, particularly Airbnb. They want to help with collecting taxes, they say, and monitoring this, because I think unlike Uber, who could kind of come in and push their way around, I think the short-term rental folks need the cooperation of the city to a greater degree.
And there's a state component to this too, because the legislature actually in the special session just passed a bill. They have to do something else in the regular session that would capture taxes on these units. I mean, hotels and motels are taxed pretty heavily, and there's a feeling it's a competitive disadvantage, and also just they need, we all need the money. So.
And how that bill shakes out is actually going to be interesting, because the original version would have called for the state to establish a registry that would include information on where these units are, who's operating them, and be a sort of central,
like that.
And there'd be a centralized source for local governments and the state government to ensure they're complying with the law. In addition to bringing in probably about $1 million for the city and another $7 million for other entities in the area. That's doesn't appear to any longer be in the version of the bill that passed, although there's some talk about what they're going to be doing during the regular session now to sort of come back.
Okay. Well, speaking of dollars for the city, Mayor Landry has a proposal, a millage proposal that's going before the voters in New Orleans April 6th for public safety.
Right. Is it April 6th?
April 9th.
April 9th, yes. So April 9th. Early voting starts this week. It's basically to support police and fire. We've been talking about this for a really long time. On the police side, it's pretty much, to follow up on what Jeff was talking about, to hire more cops, which is something that's been a tremendous need for the city for quite a long time. On the fire side, it's to deal with this big pension settlement that has been in the works for a very long time, and the Landry administration finally agreed to. Jeff has the numbers at the top of his head. I know.
The overall the increase would raise about $26.6 million per year. About 8.9 million of that would go to the firefighters for this overarching pension settlement agreement and agreement over about $75 million in back pay they owe. 17.7 would go toward the police department, and that covers most but not all of what the administration says they're going to need, in addition to the money they've already got going to the police department to pay for an expansion. They're hoping to increase the department by 90 officers next year, and then over the next several years continue that going, although that's a pretty aggressive rate, and it's not clear whether they're going to be able to hit those goals.
And one thing that I think the administration really wanted to do before they went before the voters is show some improvement, like you said, in response times, in this reorganization that has put more officers on the street. I mean, we see it as reporters. We used to get press releases from officers, now we get them from civilians. Those are, people who've moved into other jobs. And on the firefighter side, there's been this negotiation going on for a very long time. They nailed it. They got it. So, do people want to reward them? That's the question. Or do they maybe have less of a sense of urgency? Or are they maybe looking at some of these big sales tax increases coming down from the state that are going to kick in just a week before? I think these are all things to watch.
And I think there's some hot topics in the city that have kind of faded to quiet right now. There's a little bit of detente, on whether to take down the Confederate monuments, whether that plays into any election where the mayor is asking for money. In no way are those things related, but in a lot of voters' minds, they're both initiatives.
And this will be the only issue on the ballot.
There's one other issue. It's a bond issue for road work, so that's not seeking additional money for people. It's, but it would help do a lot of secondary roads, not the major roads. So I think that one's pretty non-controversial. Really, just about everybody has endorsed both of these proposals. Newspapers, BGR, business community, unions. There does not appear to be organized opposition for either of them, but it's those two measures.
And this is the kind of election, by all indications, I mean, it's going to be a low turnout election.
Yes,
but
by
usually,
design.
Usually the strategy is that the people who promote this like to keep it low profile, because then you get the chronic voter, and the chronic voter, they figure, is more likely to vote for.
And the really civic-minded people who, yes, exactly. Now, sometimes there can be a backlash if it's too low profile. Remember that Audubon Park, that Audubon Institute vote where, people kind of felt like maybe they were trying to get something over on them, so people did turn out to vote against it. I don't necessarily see any reason why that would happen here, except maybe if people are they just want to say no to something, maybe because of these other tax increases coming. We don't know.
Okay. We want to mention another issue that's going around. It's very seldom that we talk about a story that involves the Pope and the Anglican Church, but that has an impact on New Orleans, and this may have a major impact on New Orleans. There's a proposal out there which has a lot of traction to standardize the date of Easter. Easter, going back to the Council of Nicaea for very complicated reasons, was set on being on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. And this this Sunday will be that. And all of that happened unusually early this year, which is why Easter's early. And it had to do, going back to trying to get together with the date of Passover. But anyway, they've been trying to change this for years, centuries. The reason is because different elements of the church celebrate Easter on a different day. Within the Catholic Church, you got the Coptic Church and the Russian Church, and they separated on different days. And the Anglican bishop, the Bishop of Canterbury, has been very outspoken on this issue, and he's put together, and he says that they're getting a letter signed by all of his churches supporting a standardized date. Very importantly, Pope Francis, who carries a lot of weight in these circles, has also said that he favors it too. And so a lot still has to happen, but this is the most movement that there's ever been. And what the talk is that if this is approved, for Easter to probably be the second Sunday of every April, second or third Sunday. If, for example, that was the case this year, Easter would have been April 10th. Now, right now, people are saying, how about Mardi Gras? Because Mardi Gras is based on that.
Yeah.
Okay, Mardi Gras, if this was in place, if Easter would have been April 10th, Mardi Gras would have been March 23rd. If you remember, Mardi Gras was March 9th.
February.
February 23rd. If you remember, Mardi Gras is February 9th. And so Mardi Gras would be later. That is no guarantee for better weather, okay? But it is a guarantee for more people being able to attend, because some people say that the early Mardi Gras are just too close to Christmas and that it would be better. And so economically, there's a lot of justifications for that. People point out that it would be good for schools and vacation planners. From the churchman's perspective, they see it as a global unity thing, having the church all united on the same day. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury, with Bishop Welby, has gone on record predicting that this change will be made, he says, within the next 5 to 10 years.
Who decides? How does it happen?
Well, the Pope could get up and over breakfast tomorrow morning, just say, this is it.
Catholics are doing it this way.
And then all the Catholics are in.
Yeah.
But diplomatically, I think they want to get all the churches together. There are some countries where if you change a holiday, you've got to get government approval. You've got to talk to the calendar makers and that sort of thing. and so they're trying to be very, very diplomatic about it. But it could be a major move. And in the long run, this will affect, not necessarily in a bad way, but the French Quarter Festival and the Jazz Festival. It might push them back or so, a week or so. But this is happening. I think it's an important story for New Orleans.
And it's unclear whether the Pope's contacted the mayor's Carnival coordinating committee, or whether Ed Munez has signed off.
We have no evidence of it.
Ed Munez.
I will say, where I work with New Orleans Magazine, that we've supported it, that that would be a good thing. But speaking of these sort of things, there was a TV show on this past week that Fox Network did called Passion. It was some people said it was a wondrous production. Other people didn't like it as much. But it seemed to. But anyway, you looked at the state side of it in terms of credits. How do we do?
Well, like any other film production in the state, The Passion qualifies for film tax credits. Depending on which estimate you want to go with, the state's estimate of what their spending was or the production's estimate, the state's looking at paying somewhere between $2 and $3 million in tax credits for the production. That's for a production that spent about $7.5 to $11 million in.
So the tax credits are based on how much they spent.
Yeah.
And so they say we spent X, then the state says, well, your credits are Y. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. It's 30% of the amount they spend, and they get a bonus for money they spend on payroll. And it's worth noting that payroll includes folks that might live in Hollywood that are down here working during the production. So it's a pretty straightforward formula. One of the minor, again, one of the minor complications, and there's a lot of productions that do get these credits down here. Last year, when they were trying to trim back some of the credits, the legislature did put a cap not on how many credits could be issued, but how many credits could be redeemed in any year. That's about, they're allowed to issue about 100, or give money back for about 180 million credits per year. So far this year, about 110 million of those have already been redeemed. And for the Passion, that may not matter. They're going to be in next year's tax year, but that's gives you sort of a sense of the scope of all.
And the
all
production
these programs.
the production company can take those and sell that essentially for face value, or can they cash it in for less themselves?
They can do either. They can sell them, and they tend to get pretty close to face value. They can also turn them right back to the Department of Revenue, which realized that all that was happening was there was this market for them anyway, and they get a slightly less value for them there. But this essentially ends up being a cash payment to any of the films. They're not. This isn't money that they're getting off of the taxes that they're paying to the state. This is essentially just cash for a portion of what they're spending.
And the producer's argument is that we created jobs and we got a lot of publicity for your place. And
a lot of the argument focuses on publicity. That you have these productions that show off the city,
and this production, proceeded through the French Quarter. I mean, and the other thing is, other states are doing this too. We were at the forefront, but it's a competitive situation. So another argument is if we scale these back, then we might lose productions to other places.
Okay. All right, let's look ahead into the future. Steve,
well, not too far into the future, we hope to figure out who the buyer of the Times-Picayune's original building is at 3800, not original, building for the past several decades, at 3800 Howard Avenue. The three of us all spent some time in that building, and some of us went over in the past week and picked over the leftovers there. And the folks who are in there taking apart the presses and trying to liquidate the furniture have said that the deal has gone through, but it hasn't hit the property records yet. So there's no closing.
So there's a rumor that somebody has gotten it.
Somebody has bought that building. Early on, last year, I think the management of the Times-Picayune said they were considering donating it to a nonprofit at the end of this year if it came to that, but sounds like they got some money for it.
Stephanie?
Right. Louisiana presidential primary is over, but the race continues, as we know. It's interesting to watch Republicans line up between the two candidates. It's hotly contested, as we all know. Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, the major candidates left. Recently, Governor Jindal, who has been very critical of Donald Trump, said he would support him against Hillary Clinton, so that's not an endorsement. Interesting endorsement from former Congressman Bob Livingston, now one of the major lobbyists in Washington for Donald Trump. He's a real establishment guy, so that raised a lot of eyebrows. Waiting to see where other officials line up on this.
Okay, Jeff?
Well, we've mentioned it briefly already, but early voting is starting for the April 9th election this weekend, and so it's going to be interesting to see what kind of people show up at the poll, or whether that gets a lot of interest from the voters and how that goes.
Okay, well, thank you all. This has been delightful. Learned a lot. Have a joyful Easter to all of y'all. Go check out that moon after the vernal equinox. It's if it's not too crowded, it's out there. See you again next week. Bye-bye.